Welcome back to Lighting Design 101 with your instructor, Denise Remping. I am Denise Remping, come to bring you one last lesson about basic lighting fundamentals and theory. In this video, I'm going to bring you an in-depth analysis of one of my own lighting designs, incorporating many elements of the lessons I covered in the previous 10 videos. This video will be a bit longer than the others, but I'm hoping it will be filled with a lot of valuable information for you to absorb. Back in October 2017, I was involved with the Manorville Theater Company's production of a musical called Nevermore, The Imaginary Life and Mysterious Death of Edgar Allan Poe. You've seen images from this show throughout the previous videos, as I've used some of them as examples. Earlier that same year, MTC had replaced its old lighting system, which consisted of about 16 9-inch Fresnels that were frequently blowing lamps. We suspect this was due to the electrical system and not the instruments themselves, but the Fresnels were old and outdated anyway. What it was replaced with was a brand new DMX system, completely digital. We purchased 20 new LED color-changing PARs, 4 LED strip lights, and an ETC Color Source 40 lighting board. Given that I hadn't done any lighting design since college and have never worked with LEDs before, I was chomping at the bit to play with the new system. And knowing that we would be producing this incredibly unique rock musical that fall, I begged the director to let me light the show. Nevermore was not without its challenges, and there are many things I would do differently today, but I still had a lot of fun designing this show. Before I delve into the design itself, let me first cover the layout of the Manorville Opera House stage and the basic lighting plot we developed with this new system. The stage at the Opera House is about 30 feet at its widest and about 16 feet deep. There are 2 pipes hanging above the audience for housing lighting instruments. And that's it. There are no overhead pipes or battens, there isn't a fly space, there's barely any backstage space depending on the set, and the back 4 feet of the stage is covered by an overhang where the hallway above the green room is located. Given the layout, unfortunately, we cannot achieve the full 3-light McCandless method in this space. Instead, we opted for just a 2-light method. I broke the stage down into 8 lighting zones, 5 across the downstage and apron, and 3 across the upstage area. 10 lights light the front 5 zones from the pipe furthest away from the stage, and 6 lights light the 3 upstage zones and hang from the closest pipe. This leaves us with 4 additional PARs and the 4 strip lights to use as needed. Originally, the strip lights were purchased to light up the space under the upstage overhang, which often gets dipped into shadow, but they have been used for various purposes, including as footlights. For Nevermore, we built an additional platform off the front of the stage to add additional space, and 3 screens with the entirety of the Raven written on them were placed upstage beneath the overhang. Additionally, 2 balconies were added on the extreme ends of the apron. My basic plot started with the 8 lighting zones, but I had to readjust some of the lights to make up for the change in the set. For starters, I had to take one of the lights from each of the far downstage zones and refocus them up to hit the actors standing on the balconies. Then I took one light from each of the upstage zones and refocused them to hit the 3 screens. I then used barn doors to tighten the beams to just light the screens up. This left the upstage zones a little darker, but given the nature of the show, it's about the life and death of Edgar Allan Poe, a little darkness was going to only enhance the design. I then used 2 of the strip lights under the overhang and aimed them slightly downstage. These 2 strips would light up the back wall, but also provide some backlighting for the 3 screens. At high enough intensity and with no frontal light, these 3 screens, which were made from thin muslin, would be able to provide some shadows from anyone standing behind them. I took the 2 remaining strip lights and attached them to the front of the additional platform to provide some foot lighting, a necessity for a show that involved a lot of creepy Edgar Allan Poe imagery. From there, I took 2 of the extra pars we had and secured them to the side of the balconies to provide some side lighting, turning them into shin busters. With the angle of these lights, not only was I going to be able to utilize some creepy side lighting, but any actor standing in the right spot would also cast a huge shadow on the back wall as well. Shadows, another necessity for a show about Poe. I took another par and added it to the pipe closest to the stage and angled it forward to provide an overhead light for the additional platform. Unfortunately, the only overhead lighting I could manage for this show. I also borrowed 3 ellipsoidals, really small ones given the small space, from the local community college. In order to use these lights, I had to pull out a couple of the old dimmer packs to plug them into our new DMX system. 2 of these lights provided focus spotlights on stage right and stage left, and the third was used to create a long, thin line across the stage that was designed to simulate the light shining from a doorway that was only opened just a crack. I created this by focusing the ellipsoidal from the back pipe and angling it across the stage. Then I shuttered it in to create a long, thin line. Additionally, we also used fog in this production, but more for atmosphere than for lighting. The production design was very black and white, as you can see in the photos. The costumes were black and white, the set was mostly black with a few pops of cream and bronze. So as the lighting designer, I felt this allowed me a lot of freedom to play with color. I decided then to use color to not only portray emotion, but then I also gave many of the characters in the show their own color schemes, depending on their relationship with Edgar. The show is bookended in both acts by an acting troupe who have encountered Edgar on a boat. The rest of the story is then told through these actors, taking on the different roles and personalities Edgar has encountered throughout his life. I started off with a lot of blue light to create an element of mystery and spookiness that is often associated with Poe's work. These new LED lights also allowed me to use a UV option on the lights, which transforms them into an almost black light quality, which means they make brighter colors like white glow on stage. We begin with Edgar's birth, where we meet his mother, Eliza. Edgar's relationship with Eliza, we discover, is full of a lot of love and admiration. And yes, that's me. I used a lot of roses for Eliza to indicate love and sweetness. Eliza is an actress, and whenever she is performing, there is a follow spot on her. Note how I pop out of these images, but you are not distracted by any bright white circles behind me. This is because we kept the intensity of the follow spot low. This is a mostly dark show, and a high-intensity beam would have been way too bright. We also meet David, Edgar's father, who suffers from alcoholism and a very pessimistic worldview. For David, I used green lights to indicate illness and unease. Edgar inherits a lot of his father's shortcomings later in life. We also get to meet Edgar's siblings, his younger sister Rosie and his older brother Henry. Henry is the big dreamer in the family who speaks of one day exploring the world. For Henry, I used gold to indicate the richness of his dreams, but this color later on in the show also provides us with that old world feel I mentioned in a previous video. Edgar's father abandons his family, and his mother eventually succumbs to tuberculosis and dies. While lying in her bed, struggling to breathe, this is where we first encounter that crack-like light I mentioned before, as Edgar peers into the room to watch his mother. Eliza's death is also our first encounter with Edgar's dark and morbid imagination. He imagines his mother with skeletal hands as she lays dying, and upon her death, we get to see the infamous Raven for the first time. Whenever Edgar's imagination takes over the stage, this is when I would light up those 3 Raven panels upstage to indicate the inner workings of his mind taking over. After Eliza's death, the Poe children are split up, and Edgar is sent to live with his foster parents, the Allans. Fanny Allan becomes another mother figure to Edgar and is filled with giddy sweetness. However, the Allan estate incites many a nightmare for Edgar, mostly due to its creepy decor and because of Fanny's husband, Jock. Jock is a tyrant and not very nice to Edgar. For Jock, I used a lot of reds to indicate anger, resentment, and hostility. There are some bright moments for Edgar at the Allans, including a positive encounter with his school teachers who expressed their love for his creativity and his talent for poetry. Here, we encounter the first of what I call Edgar's rock star moments. He sings a song about becoming a glorious poet who will rival the angels themselves. Unfortunately, the Color Source 40 is not as advanced as the Ion or the Element, so it was not able to do any link or loops to create sequencing. However, it does come with pre-recorded sequences and effects I was able to use to cycle through a series of colors during this rockstar moment. Jock does not wish to see Edgar turn into a poet, believing that art is a frivolous pursuit. So he tries to instill discipline in Edgar. Note the use of red lights in this scene. Fanny eventually reveals that she is not well and hears voices in her head. As the imp in her head begins to take over, I switch from bright, warm colors to once again using green to portray illness. Jock has Fanny committed to an asylum, and reds come into the scene as she's being taken away to show how Jock's control has taken over. Fanny eventually kills herself by throwing herself out a window. Fanny's death hits Edgar hard, and his darker imaginings really start to take over. Act 1 ends with a musical number about just that, which is then repeated even bigger in the finale of the show. Here there are a lot of dark shadows and creepy lighting, and of course, the panels in the back are illuminated to indicate his imagination taking over. The beginning of Act 2 sees Edgar in the graveyard mourning for the loss of both Fanny and his mother Eliza. He's visited by their ghosts. I use a follow spot on both Fanny and Eliza for this number to once again make them pop from the scene and give them a sort of otherworldly look. Again, note how the follow spot brightens their appearance, but you are not distracted by any large white circles in the background. At the graveyard, Edgar meets Elmira, a young girl who shares his proclivity for dark and creepy things. She tells Edgar a scary story about how a woman was buried alive. Note the use of spooky foot lighting in these images, like the flashlight under the chin effect I mentioned in a previous video. Edgar and Elmira fall in love, indicated by warm pinks to match the lightness of this musical number. Eventually, Edgar leaves for college. While there, things do not go well, and he gets into arguments with Jock about money, Jock refusing to send him what he needs to succeed. Edgar turns to gambling and booze, and eventually runs out of money and is forced to leave college before finishing. Before leaving for college, Edgar had promised to write to Elmira every day. However, she never receives his letters, as her father had kept them from her, and she goes on to marry someone else. Edgar returns to witness her marriage. His imagination takes over once again, and he envisions her as a corpse bride. To make things worse, Jock has remarried and had a child of his own. Edgar is allowed to stay with them, but is treated like an unwanted guest. He is tormented again by the ghost of Fanny. Again, note the use of the follow spot to make her stand out. And he eventually decides to leave the Allan estate. He goes to stay with his aunt Muddy Clem, and is reunited with his brother Henry. Henry introduces Edgar to some literary agents, and his writing career begins. He is momentarily happy again, reunited briefly with his sister and brother. But, as is a common theme in this show, death strikes again, this time taking Henry, afflicted by the same consumption that took his mother. Edgar tries once again to turn to his foster father Jock for help, but Jock refuses. Eventually, Jock dies, and Edgar imagines that he is the one who killed him. Red here not only indicates his hatred and anger toward Jock, but the murder and mayhem in his heart as well. His life seemingly at its lowest, Edgar turns to more booze and falls deeper into depression. More images of the Raven appear to him, his dark imagination taking over. His aunt then introduces him to her daughter, Sissy. Yes, his cousin. Different times, man, different times. And they fall in love. Once again, the stage is filled with roses, pinks, and violets as the two of them are married. Edgar's career begins to take off, and we come to the second rock star moment of the show, which is a musical rendition of his most infamous poem, The Raven. His imagination dominates this scene, and again we turn to flashing lights and sequencing to simulate a rock concert look, or at least what I could manage in the tiny space and limited lighting resources. It's a bit hard to tell in this footage, but the strip lights are cycling through a series of violet and blue lights, and the panels are cycling through reds, oranges, and yellows very rapidly. There is also a bright white light that flashes on and off to enhance that rock star theme. Edgar, still afflicted with the same addiction his father possessed, continues to drink, and eventually his career starts to take a hit because of it, and because of some nasty rumors spread about him. And to add insult to injury, Sissy also dies, also of tuberculosis. As his depression and mental anguish deepens, we get more ravens appearing on stage, and Edgar contemplates suicide. Note the use of green light here to indicate illness once again. However, at just the right moment, Elmira returns, now a widow. They rekindle their romance, with more pinks and roses appearing on stage, and Edgar reflects about the struggles he's endured in his life. The ghosts of his past once again haunt him, and once again the follow spot is used to highlight each ghostly memory as they cross the stage. We return then to the boat on which he encountered the acting troupe, and back to the blues from the beginning. Edgar is journeying upriver to a potential job he has waiting for him, the prospect of a good future. However, it is revealed that this troupe isn't who they say they are, but rather are the characters and nightmares from his imagination that have haunted and tormented him throughout his life. Edgar flees from the boat and is found days later, near death and talking to himself. There is a gentle, quiet moment in the show as Edgar lays dying. There is not a lot of light being used at this point. He is visited by the ghosts of his past again, ending with his mother, and Edgar, standing within the long, thin light once again, dies. His death is marked by the single beam of light and eventually fades to black. We end the show with the ensemble returning to reprise the number at the end of Act 1, reflecting the life and imagination of Poe's work. This number builds to one big grand finale where I once again return to flashing and sequencing lights. You'll note that the fog comes into play here as well. As the number and the show comes to an end, we build to the final and my favorite look of the whole show. As the ensemble gathers around Edgar, the footlights become more predominant, and it all ends with the whole cast striking one last dramatic pose, and the only lights remaining are that solitary overhead light I added, casting a blue light down on the group, and just a hint of light from the strip lights in the back to give it a little backlighting. Then fade to black. And there you have a very quick rundown of one of my own lighting designs. Hopefully, this has given you a better sense of how all the elements I discussed in this series can be implemented into a production. This is just one show, however, and certainly not meant as an example of an A+ design. Like I said, there are many things I would have done differently, and you will probably be just as critical of your own future designs as well. It is my hope that this series has brought you a better understanding of lights as an integral part of a theatrical production, and a greater appreciation for lighting as an element of design. If you are examining light differently and asking yourself those same questions, how can I reproduce this on stage? Then I know I have done my job. Again, the internet is a great resource, and many a designer will have different things to teach you and will have different opinions about lights than I do. So do not stop your education with just me. Please go out, talk to other designers, go watch other productions, and learn everything you can. Thank you for watching.